These are both artifacts from the Apollo 15 lunar mission. Apollo 15 was the fourth mission that landed on the moon. They represent quite complicated technology and the form that technology at the time took. In 1969, we went to the moon for the first time. From 1969 to 1972, 12 men landed on the moon, 24 men orbited the moon, and since 1972, no human has been back to the moon. We achieved this tremendous feat when computers were in their infancy. On the spacecraft for Apollo 15, there was an onboard computer. It was quite small, and it held the equivalent of about 36,000 words. Early versions of iPhones held about 640 trillion words. So this was tiny in terms of the capacity. It was configured to help with all of the technical aspects that were necessary to land the lunar module onto the moon. With these spacecraft, they're enormously complex scientifically, and yet they only have that small computer that holds 36,000 words, right? But there are all sorts of operational phases to the mission that the three guys have to know because they have to operate the spacecraft. It's all manual, and the operational guidelines, the technical details they need to operate the spacecraft, most of them are not on a computer, they're in hard copy form, they're in books like this. These small books were set aside for different specific aspects of the mission. So this one here is for the command service module's entry back into Earth's atmosphere and splashdown. There were other ones for different phases of the mission. There were larger books that were 8 by 11 that were for bigger picture parts of the mission. So there was a big 8 by 11 hard copy book like this that was hundreds of pages called the Flight Plan. And that actually laid out every aspect of the entire mission for those 12 days. The astronauts had to use these in order to know what to do. Of course, they practiced for years, so they're running through all of these things time and time again, and they learn it pretty cold because they've got to be able to do it quickly. But they have the books in case they need to look things up. Also, in case they need to write something down, they wrote it in the hard copy book, right? So these books were on the mission, they were in the capsules, and then NASA could use that data to know what was happening in terms of the specific data with the spacecraft and operating it during the mission. As you can see, this is a lot of stuff. When the astronauts were training, what would happen is they would realize, I need some of this information quickly. I don't need to flip through the whole book to find kind of the highlights that I need. So what they did was they started writing notes that they would stick to the console of the simulator so that they could see the main points they needed. Almost like Post-it notes, right? That then became more official once NASA realized these would be quite helpful. So instead of just like random pieces of paper, they ended up developing what you see here, which is a cue card. They have the information that's important printed on them, and they have Velcro on the back, so you could stick them up on the console and you could see them when you needed to, and you could also write notes about what was happening. The cue cards were really important. They were not kind of officially in the operational specs like the flight data files, because they were much more this shorthand that the astronauts did as they were training. And this happened before Apollo 15. It happened on some of the earlier missions, but the cue cards were really quite an interesting innovation that happened by necessity when the astronauts were training and realized what they needed. Because NASA was quite a different organization at the time, it was much newer and smaller and more collaborative in a sense. So you have to remember, NASA began in 1958. In 1971, it's still, just a little over 10 years old. And it had much more of a feel of a startup, right? Think of tech startups. Almost all of the people who ran NASA and the astronauts were in their 30s. These were young guys, and it was mostly guys. There were a few women who were quite creative, innovative. They did oftentimes come from military backgrounds or aerospace backgrounds, which were more structured, but at the same time, it was a much more nimble organization and able to adapt to what was necessary. And the other part of that was that they had this goal John F. Kennedy put forth a goal for the US in 1961 that we would land a man on the moon by the end of the decade, which we did in 1969 with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. We accomplished that with this technology. And so there was this extraordinary coming together and everyone being really focused on one goal. My father actually told an interesting story about this, how every part of NASA, every part of the contractors and those organizations was focused on this central goal. And they kind of summarized it as man, moon, 1970. You get a man on the moon by 1970. And that was it. And everybody at every level of the organization, that was the focus. Another aspect of the human nature of the technology at the time and of the innovation, the Apollo astronauts had a lot of say in what was happening with the spacecraft, right? I mean, they helped develop these cue cards. So they weren't separate from what was happening. They had a lot of input into the missions and the operational and technical aspects. And each crew had a backup crew. In case one of the prime crew got sick at the last minute, the backup crew could substitute in. And that happened once or twice. So the backup crew is training with the prime crew through all of this stuff. They're doing the simulator stuff. They're kind of following along all of the training, so they know the mission really well. And the crews got to be quite close because you're training together for years, literally. There was a lot of camaraderie among these crews from being test pilots or fighter pilots in the military and from particular military branches. And the Apollo 15 crew was actually all Air Force. All three of the men were in the Air Force. The backup crew, the main guy was in the Navy, so they did a lot of joking and pranks in order to relieve the tension of what they were doing, which was so, extraordinary and enormously difficult and complicated. So a lot of times what the backup crew would do is they would put little jokes or funny sayings or words and they would stick them in different parts of the capsule where they wouldn't be in the way, or in some of the flight data files. On the main flight plan on the front, they had done a little label maker sticker thing that they put on there that said "Fly Navy," because they're joking with the Air Force crew. But what was really great with this entry, the Command Service Module entry checklist, is the thing the guys are going to look at as they're starting to do the entry into Earth's orbit and splashdown. And I should mention that Apollo 15 was the first lunar mission that the guys did not have to go into quarantine afterwards. Apollo 11, 12, and 14, they made all the astronauts go into quarantine because they didn't know if there would be some weird thing on the surface of the moon that they needed to make sure wasn't infectious or something. So 15, they had decided everything's fine, there's nothing we're bringing back from the moon, so the guys don't have to go into quarantine after the mission, they can go straight home. So the backup crew, at the front of this flight data file, they put in photos of the two wives. Mary Irwin, the wife of Jim Irwin, and Lurton Scott, my mother, the wife of my dad, David Scott. And the first one says, "Hey, no quarantine this time. Isn't that great?" And my mom is saying, "You're telling me." And when I taught my course last semester and showed my students this, one of them said, "It's an original meme." And it was. It's like the memes, right? These photos with the little captions that are joking about, "Oh, isn't this great? We don't have to have quarantine this time when the guys come home." So again, trying to bring the human element into work that was extraordinarily complex and difficult and momentous, and this relieved a lot of the tension and brought some humor to things, and it's a great story, I think.